One of the worst storms of 2024 thus far will be possible in the United States today, and this will pose the threat of a tornado outbreak, where we could see several strong to even violent tornadoes in the central and southern plains. And then once we go into tomorrow, we're going to be dealing with the potential for another severe weather outbreak. So in today's forecast, we're going to break down everything that you need to know about today and tomorrow's severe weather event, and why this could be one of the biggest severe weather weekends that we've seen all year long. So let's begin with what's happening for today in terms of the severe weather outlook. And the Storm Prediction Center, at least as of the outlook earlier this morning at 2 a.m., has maintained a moderate risk for severe weather for now in parts of the central and southern plains. And you might be wondering, what do you mean by that? Well, the Storm Prediction Center did mention that a high risk for severe weather is in play today in the central plains and even in the southern plains in parts of Oklahoma and Kansas. Now, as of the time of recording this forecast, it is still a moderate risk for severe weather, but by the time you see this, they may have upgraded to a high risk, and that high risk will probably be right in the narrow corridor here in parts of central and northern Oklahoma back into southern Kansas if they do end up issuing that. Either way, we are still going to be talking about the potential for a significant tornado outbreak, with strong to potentially violent tornadoes being possible today, in addition to the threat for significant damaging winds and large hail. Now, do not get too caught up in the risk areas. This is a really big misconception. People think the worst of the severe weather is always going to be in the darkest shaded areas, or at least the highest risk areas. That is not true at all. This actually, a lot of the time, we do see strong and long track tornadoes, even in enhanced and sometimes even in slight risks for severe weather. So you need to stay vigilant and weather aware, even if you are in the 2, 3, or 4 out of 5 severe weather risk, which is the slight, enhanced, or moderate risk. And even in the marginal threat, you should be staying weather aware today and have multiple ways to receive alerts, as there will be a potential again for tornadoes. Here's that tornado threat for today. Notice there's a hatched area, and as I mentioned, strong to violent tornadoes is a possibility today. The Storm Prediction Center used this exact wording for today's severe weather outlook because the environment is just so primed. If any storms are surface-based and discrete, we will have that potential for strong and potentially, again, very intense tornadoes here in the central and southern plains. And I don't use those words to scare you. I'm just telling you that's the nature of today's event. If we have surface-based storms that remain discrete, this event could be pretty bad. And that's why I'm trying to tell you ahead of time here that you should be prepared. Now, this could be another situation like what we saw a few weeks ago with the high risk in Oklahoma. We might only see like 1 or 2 strong tornadoes, but 1 or 2 are still really not good for anybody. They could still produce some significant damage. Now, overall, the greatest concern will be in southern and central Kansas, back into western Missouri, and even into Oklahoma, and as well as back into a very small sliver there of north central Texas near Wichita Falls. We'll be talking more about the timing and where I think the greatest threat will be today in just a moment. There's also a significant damaging wind risk, which includes areas back over in Kansas, Missouri, and northeast Oklahoma, where we are expecting some sort of little MCS to develop later this evening, and that'll produce the threat for some significant damaging winds as high as 80 to even maybe 90 miles per hour. In addition to all this, there will be a potential for some significant hail today in the central and southern plains, where some areas could see hail as large as the size of softballs, so make sure that you're protecting your vehicle. Even though this should remain a slightly more isolated threat in nature, any of these initial discrete cells, especially back over in southern Kansas, will have the chance to produce some significant hail today. Now, there are many indicators that I can show you to basically give you an idea that today's severe weather event could be substantial when it comes to the tornado risk. I'm not going to show you every single ingredient because that would take way too long, but I'm going to show you a couple of key ingredients that can kind of give you an idea of why this could be a significant tornado event here today in the central and southern plains, one of which is the storm relative helicity. This basically gives us an idea of the corkscrew effect that we have in the atmosphere with the spin all across the atmosphere, from the low levels all the way up into the upper levels, and values over 250 really give us an idea that there's at least going to be some sort of more significant potential for tornadoes, and we are going to have values across the board upwards of 500 to 600 here for storm relative helicity. So this is a very favorable environment, and we are going to have a lot of spin in the atmosphere today. And another thing I can show you to kind of simplify this down is the hodographs, and what we are basically looking at is a chart anywhere from the surface all the way up into the upper atmospheres when it comes to the spin in the atmosphere today. And notice the hodographs right over Oklahoma today. There is a lot of torque and spin spin on these photographs. Look at this thing. It's a big slinky, basically, a big slingshot. And what that gives you an idea, again, of is that there is a lot of spin. We're going to have winds near the surface that are coming out of one direction, and they just kind of change as we go up into the atmosphere, and that creates that spin and eventually creates that potential for tornadoes. So basically, any supercells that remain discrete and that can remain discrete for a long period of time could produce long track tornadoes, and it wouldn't be too hard to do so as long as they do remain surface-based. And what I mean by that is storms that are closer to the ground. We can't really have elevated storms that are over 10,000 feet up or whatever it might be that are producing tornadoes. It's a very hard sort of phenomenon to happen. So as long as they're close to the surface, this should be a pretty easy task to happen today. And again, it just depends on if those storms fire up, and I'll kind of give you the confidence level I have of each individual area here in just a second in terms of where storms will be more likely to fire up. And here's the significant tornado parameter values, which again, just another way to show you the tornado risk today. Many areas with values over 10, which is really kind of off the charts. Even the high risk that we had back a couple weeks ago in Oklahoma, there the values there I think were like 8 to 9 in some areas, but you know, this event is showing upwards of 10 to 12, and that's just really high, and again, really off the charts. As I mentioned before, there have to be storms in this environment for those sorts of things to be used up, and as long as we have discrete cells, this environment is really capable of severe weather. All right, let's talk more about the timing today and kind of give you an idea of what the confidence level, in my opinion, is for storm development and the tornado threat overall in each individual area, because really, I know a lot of people are like, well, there's damaging winds and hail, but really we're most concerned about the tornado risk. Keep in mind, large hail damaging winds are possible, but I'm going to kind of break down the tornado risk a bit more in detail here. So back over in North Texas, we're going to start here. There's going to be a dry line setup here, and we're going to have storms firing off probably right around 5 to 6 o'clock back over in parts of western central Texas. This includes anywhere from Abilene back into Wichita Falls, and this particular area is going to be a bit more of a low confidence area in my opinion when it comes to severe weather. What does that mean? That means that I'm not super confident that storms are actually going to fire up here. However, any storms that do develop and remain discrete will have an elevated chance at a potential, again, for tornadoes that could be strong and or long tracked. And the HRRR model does represent that potential very clearly. The Storm Prediction Center also mentioned that this model in particular is showing this potential, and if that can kind of, you know, that those trends continue, this very easily could be a high risk, at least back up in Oklahoma, maybe even down here into north central Texas, but capping may be an issue here. So that's something to keep in mind as well. I think there are more problems with the setup in North Texas, even though the HRRR model shows these really robust supercells. I think there are more problems here, in particular in North Texas, when it comes to the overall setup. I think back over in areas like Oklahoma, the threat of severe weather is a bit more clear cut. As long as storms do fire up, I think we have a very strong and long track tornado potential here. This is right around 6 to 7 o'clock when we'll have storm initiation back to the west of Oklahoma City. Notice again, any storms that remain discrete or even semi-discrete will have a more elevated chance for strong and long track tornadoes. I have a more medium confidence here of there being storms that produce the threat for tornadoes, meaning that overall we have a better shot here of storms than in comparison to Texas. By 9 to 10 o'clock, those storms will probably continue to move east. Any storms that can continue after the sun sets will continue to pose a threat for nocturnal, strong, and long track tornadoes. And eventually by about 11 to 12 o'clock, I think the majority of those storms start to fizzle. There might still be 1 or 2 storms here in Oklahoma producing a threat for tornadoes up until midnight. And then after that, I think the threat starts to simmer down in Oklahoma. And then before we dive into Kansas timing, I do want to mention we'll be live today and tonight for this severe weather coverage. So make sure that you are subscribed down below and click the bell icon so you're notified when we do go live. This is what Kansas looks like today. Kansas will have the most storm activity more than likely out of any of these 3 states we've been talking about, which is Texas, Oklahoma, and as well as Kansas. This area will have a lot more storm activity more than likely, with this area of storms in particular going to be the area to watch for tornadoes, but also the area to watch for substantial hail and as well as substantial damaging winds. By 9 to 10 o'clock, those storms become a bit more clustered, and by 11 to 12 o'clock, they continue to move eastbound with mostly a damaging wind threat, but also the potential still for a few tornadoes as that continues to move east and organizes more into an MCS. This is what we're looking at overnight tonight into tomorrow morning. We'll continue to watch storms moving across Missouri, producing damaging winds and QLCS tornadoes all the way into areas like Illinois and Indiana. And eventually by the afternoon hours, those storms are moving throughout Kentucky, and we'll be watching for our next round of storms to develop across areas like Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri, where more large hail, damaging winds, and even a few tornadoes will be a possibility again as we go into Sunday. Sunday's risk of severe weather is still a very large area. It's actually going to be larger than today's area, but overall it's not as high of a risk. We have an enhanced risk across parts of the lower Midwest and as well as the Ohio Valley, with a slight and marginal threat that expand from Texas and Oklahoma all the way back over into Ohio and Michigan. I do think there is a chance that we get a moderate risk for damaging winds somewhere in here as we go into Sunday, but that still remains uncertain. It just depends on the confidence level there. I do think damaging winds will be the main concern undoubtedly with this event, especially if we have these clusters and lines of storms that produce significant damaging winds. The other thing I'd be watching for, though, is the potential for tornadoes. Even though it's not as high of a risk as today, we could end up seeing maybe a 10% hatched area somewhere in like southern Illinois or southern Indiana, but that still remains a little bit uncertain. So stay tuned, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and we'll keep you posted with the latest as we get closer to this severe weather event. And again, we'll be live later today covering the severe weather outbreak potential today in the central and southern plains.